Welcome to this journey through one of Paris's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a case that unfolded not in the city's elegant boulevards, but in the labyrinth of bones 6 stories beneath them. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will disturb you in a way few other accounts can, forcing you to confront the darkness that exists just below the surface of civilization itself. We're about to delve into a mystery that shocked Belle Epoque Paris, where the boundaries between life and death blurred in the ancient tunnels holding 6 million souls, and where murderers discovered the perfect hiding place, a catacomb so vast that bodies could disappear forever. What happened in those limestone passages in 1904 would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about crime, concealment, and the city they believed they had mapped completely. It was the year 1904. The world was still reeling from the Industrial Revolution's transformation of society, while Paris, the city of light, stood at the pinnacle of art, culture, and modernity. The Eiffel Tower, just 15 years old, dominated the skyline. Electric streetlights illuminated the Grands boulevards where well-dressed Parisians strolled past cafes where revolutionary ideas about art and philosophy were being born. This was the Paris of the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era, where optimism and progress seemed unstoppable. But beneath this glittering surface, literally beneath the cobblestones and the sewers and the foundations of apartment buildings, existed another Paris entirely. A Paris of eternal darkness, a Paris of bones. The Paris Catacombs were not ancient. They were not even particularly old by European standards. They were a solution to a very modern problem: what to do with the dead when the living run out of space. By the late 18th century, Paris's cemeteries had become grotesque. The Cimetière des Innocents, the city's largest burial ground, had been receiving bodies for nearly 1,000 years. The ground level had risen by more than 2 meters from accumulated human remains. The smell was unbearable. Neighboring basements filled with a peculiar black liquid that seeped through walls, a mixture of decomposed flesh and groundwater. When a cellar wall collapsed in 1780, releasing a torrent of corpses and liquefied remains into a nearby building, the city could no longer ignore the crisis. For centuries, Paris had been built from limestone mined directly beneath it. Roman quarrymen had started the excavation, and medieval builders had continued it, honeycombing the ground beneath the expanding city with over 200 miles of tunnels. By the 1700s, these were largely abandoned, a vast, dark network of voids that occasionally caused spectacular collapses when the surface above proved too heavy for the hollowed-out ground below. The decision was practical. If macabre, empty the cemeteries, transport the bones to the old quarries, stack them neatly, seal the entrances, and forget about them. Between 1785 and 1814, millions of skeletons made this journey. Night after night, black-draped carts rattled through Paris streets, carrying bones from overflowing cemeteries to the quarry entrances. Priests chanted, torches flickered, and down in the tunnels, workers arranged the remains with surprising artistry, femurs and skulls forming decorative walls, tibia stacked in neat rows, creating a necropolis that was both practical storage and inadvertent monument. 6 million people found their final resting place in the catacombs. Peasants and nobles, rich and poor, famous and forgotten, all equal in death, their bones stripped of identity, arranged by cemetery of origin but otherwise anonymous. Maximilien Robespierre might be there. Charles Perrault, who wrote Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, was certainly there. Countless victims of the French Revolution's guillotine joined them. The bones were history made physical, centuries of Parisian life reduced to calcium and shadows. By 1904, the official catacombs, the small section open to public tours, had become a minor tourist attraction. But this represented less than 1% of the tunnel network. The rest, the Empire of Death as it was sometimes called, remained sealed, forbidden, unmapped in its totality. And in that darkness, someone had discovered opportunity. Paris in 1904 was a city of extraordinary contrasts. Above ground, the Universal Exposition of 1900 had recently concluded, leaving Paris transformed. The first metro line had just opened, revolutionary in its electric-powered efficiency. The Grand Palais and Petit Palais stood new and gleaming. Art Nouveau architecture was revolutionizing design. Pablo Picasso had recently arrived in Montmartre, joining a community of artists who were reimagining what art could be. The city proper held over 2 million people. crowded into apartments that ranged from elegant Haussmannian buildings with their characteristic wrought iron balconies to cramped workers' quarters in districts like Belleville and Ménilmontant. The wealthy dined on oysters and champagne in restaurants with crystal chandeliers. The poor survived on bread, cheap wine, and whatever work they could find in factories that were transforming France from an agricultural nation into an industrial power. Crime, naturally, accompanied this density. The prefecture of police, headquartered on the Ile de la Cité, dealt with everything from petty theft to violent assaults. But Paris prided itself on being civilized, modern, rational. This was the age of scientific policing. Alphonse Bertillon had recently developed anthropometry, the systematic measurement of criminals for identification. Photography was being used in investigations. The police considered themselves progressive, sophisticated, capable of solving any crime through reason and methodology. They had not anticipated the catacombs. The official position was simple. The catacombs were sealed. A small section near Place d'Enfer Rochereau was open for tours, carefully managed, with guides leading groups through the same predetermined route. The rest of the tunnels, the vast majority, were closed, secured, inaccessible. Warning signs posted at known entrances declared, "Arrêtez! C'est ici l'Empire de la Mort." Stop. This is the Empire of Death. But anyone who lived in certain quartiers of Paris knew the truth. The catacombs were not sealed. They could not be sealed. There were too many entrances, too many forgotten wells and basement passages and quarry shafts. Urban explorers called cataphiles had been venturing into the forbidden sections for decades, mapping rooms that no official survey included, discovering chambers filled with bones arranged in patterns that suggested someone had been down there recently, working by lamplight, for purposes unknown. In the working-class neighborhoods above Les Halles and Montparnasse, people sometimes heard strange sounds emanating from cellar walls, footsteps that could not belong to anyone in the building, voices that echoed from stone where no passage should exist. A few brave or foolish souls had followed these sounds, prying away loose stones to reveal openings into darkness that stretched beyond the reach of any lamp. Some of these explorers never returned. Most dismissals were mundane. They had gotten lost, emerged miles away, too embarrassed to admit their folly. They had fallen into one of the countless pits and sinkholes that pocked the tunnels, dying of their injuries in the dark. They had simply decided to leave Paris entirely, starting new lives elsewhere and letting worried families imagine the worst. But there were stories, whispered in cafes, shared in markets, of something else. Of people who had ventured into the catacombs looking for treasures rumored to be hidden there, only to find evidence that the tunnels were not as abandoned as authorities claimed. Fresh tool marks on walls, recent boot prints in the dust, and once allegedly a makeshift camp with blankets and food supplies, suggesting someone was living down there, existing entirely beneath the city, sustained by who knows what means. The police dismissed these stories as urban legends. Paris had enough real crime without chasing phantoms through tunnels. And besides, what criminal would choose to hide in the catacombs when the city above offered 1,000 better sanctuaries? This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The discovery began, as so many disasters do, with good intentions. On March 14, 1904, a group of engineering students from the École Polytechnique decided to map a section of the restricted catacombs as an unofficial project. They were young, ambitious, fascinated by the challenge of documenting what the city had tried to forget. Their leader, a serious young man named Auguste Morel, had obtained crude maps from a former quarry inspector and convinced his fellows that they could accomplish something genuinely useful, creating a proper survey of at least a small section of the unmapped tunnels. They entered through a partially bricked-up passage in a basement in the 14th arrondissement, bringing with them surveying equipment, strong lamps fueled by carbide, food for a day underground, and the confidence of young men who believed their education made them capable of anything. The tunnels were everything they had imagined and worse. The ceiling height varied from spacious chambers where 5 men could stand shoulder to crawlways. The bones were everywhere, not just in the organized walls of the official ossuary, but scattered, vertebrae lying in puddles, skulls lodged in crevices, small bones that crunched underfoot despite their careful steps. The limestone walls wept moisture that glistened in their lamplight, and every sound echoed strangely. creating false directions that made navigation treacherous. They marked their path with chalk, drawing arrows that would guide them back to the entrance. Auguste kept careful notes, sketching the tunnel layout, measuring distances with a measuring tape, marking chamber dimensions and noting the direction of passages. They were methodical, thorough, professional. 4 hours into their expedition, they found the first room. It was not marked on any of their maps, official or otherwise. A side passage they almost missed, hidden behind a pile of rubble that looked natural but, upon closer inspection, had been deliberately arranged. Beyond it, a chamber perhaps 5 meters square, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. And inside, evidence of habitation. There were blankets, filthy, moth-eaten, but recognizably modern. A few tin cans that had once held food, their labels long since rotted away. A broken lantern, and scratched into the limestone wall with what must have been tremendous patience and effort. Words in French, "Forgive me what I have become." The students stood in silence, their lamplight casting wild shadows across the walls. This was no ancient message, no historical curiosity. The lettering was recent, crude but clear, carved with something sharp, perhaps a knife or piece of metal. "Someone lived here," one of the students whispered. His voice echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Someone might still live here," another added, glancing nervously at the darkness beyond their light's reach. Auguste made them continue. They were scientists, he reminded them, not frightened children. They would document what they found, report it to authorities, and let the police investigate. They would not let superstition or unease compromise their work. They proceeded deeper. The tunnels twisted, descended, opened into chambers they could barely illuminate with their lamps. They found more bones, always bones, but also things that should not be there. A woman's shoe, relatively recent, lying beside a skull. A broken pocket watch stopped at 3:47, its case corroded but its mechanism still visible. A length of rope tied around a column, its purpose unclear but its newness evident. And then they found the bodies, not ancient bones like the millions stacked in the walls. Fresh bodies, recent bodies. Bodies in various stages of decomposition, lying in a natural depression where water had pooled and then evaporated, leaving the corpses in a grotesque tableau. There were 3 of them, visible in the students' lamplight. 2 men and what appeared to be a woman, though decay made certainty difficult. They wore clothing that might have been fashionable a few months ago, now rotted and stained. Their faces, what remained of faces, were turned upward, mouths open, as if they had died screaming or gasping for air that never came. The smell was indescribable. Even in the cold dampness of the catacombs, decomposition had worked its inevitable chemistry. The students reeled back, several of them retching, their lamps swinging wildly and casting monstrous shadows. "We leave," Auguste commanded, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Now, we mark the route and we leave and we tell the police." No one argued. The journey back to the surface took less than an hour. They abandoned all pretense of careful surveying, following their chalk marks in a near run that left them breathless and terrified. They emerged into a basement in late afternoon, blinking in light that seemed impossibly bright after hours in darkness, and immediately sent for the police. Inspector Lucien Devereaux of the Prefecture of Police was not a man easily disturbed. In 20 years of service, he had investigated murders both brutal and calculated, had seen poverty's cruelties and wealth's corruptions, had developed a professional detachment that allowed him to examine the worst of human behavior without flinching. But the catacombs unsettled him. He arrived at the entrance with 4 officers, a police doctor and Auguste Morel, who had agreed, with obvious reluctance, to guide them back to the discovery. They descended into the tunnels with electric torches, far superior to the students' carbide lamps, creating pools of harsh white light that somehow made the shadows deeper, more impenetrable. The journey took longer than Auguste remembered. Several times he hesitated at intersections, studying his sketches, searching for chalk marks that had already begun to fade or had been smudged by their panicked retreat. The tunnels all looked the same, limestone walls carved by ancient tools, low ceilings that forced them to stoop, endless darkness beyond their lights. And the bones. Always the bones, millions of them, pressing in from all sides, a reminder that death was patient and universal, and ultimately claimed everything. They found the chamber with the scratched message first. Inspector Devereaux studied it carefully, running his fingers over the carved letters. "How recent?" he asked the police doctor. Dr. Henri Beaumont examined the limestone dust on the floor beneath the message, rubbed some between his fingers. "Weeks, perhaps. Certainly not years. The dust hasn't been disturbed by moisture or settled into the carved grooves. Whoever made this was here recently, or is still here," one of the officers muttered. Casting his torch beam into the darkness of adjacent tunnels, they continued, following Auguste's increasingly uncertain navigation. The air grew damper, colder. Water dripped from the ceiling with rhythmic persistence, each drop echoing like a distant clock counting down to something inevitable. And then they found the bodies again. By electric torchlight, the scene was even more horrific than Auguste's description had suggested. 3 corpses, but a more careful examination revealed a 4th, partially concealed beneath rubble. All were in various stages of decomposition, suggesting they had died at different times, perhaps weeks apart. Dr. Beaumont approached with professional calm, kneeling beside the nearest body despite the smell, examining what remained of a man's torso. The clothing was of reasonable quality, a wool coat, now rotted and stained, but originally well made. The man's hands showed no signs of manual labor. "These were not working-class victims. Cause of death?" Inspector Devereaux asked. The doctor carefully turned the skull, studying it in the torchlight. "Blunt force trauma. See here, the cranium is fractured, struck from behind with considerable force. Death would have been relatively quick." He moved to the second body, that of a younger man. The same pattern, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The third body, the woman, showed similar injuries, though her skull was less well preserved, making precise determination difficult. "Murdered," Devereaux said flatly. "It was not a question. All of them," the doctor confirmed. "Struck from behind, killed quickly, and left here. The 4th body is too decomposed for me to examine properly without moving it, but I suspect the same pattern." The inspector stood slowly, his torch beam sweeping across the chamber. "Who were they? Why were they down here?" Auguste cleared his throat. "Perhaps they were cataphiles, explorers like us. The catacombs have always attracted adventurers." "Then who killed them?" Devereaux demanded. "And why?" "Robbery?" The doctor shook his head. "The first victim still wears a pocket watch. I can see the chain. The woman has rings on her fingers. If this was robbery, it was remarkably selective. One of the officers, a young man named Petit, had been exploring the chamber's perimeter." He called out now, his voice tight with discovery. "Inspector, you need to see this." Beyond the bodies, partially hidden by a natural column of limestone, was another opening, a passage leading deeper into the catacombs. And in the passage, clear in the dust, were footprints. Recent footprints, barefoot impressions, elongated and strange, leading away into darkness. Devereaux studied them with growing unease. The prints were adult-sized but oddly shaped, as if the feet were malformed or walking on tiptoe. They led away into a tunnel so low that following would require crawling, venturing even deeper into the labyrinth. "We need reinforcements," he said finally. "More men, more lights, surveying equipment. We're going to map every tunnel in this section, search every chamber. Whoever did this might still be down here." "Inspector," Dr. Beaumont said quietly, "look at the decomposition rates. These bodies died weeks apart. The first perhaps 2 months ago, the most recent within the last 3 weeks. If there's a killer, they've been active for at least 2 months, possibly longer. There could be more bodies." The thought hung in the air like the tomb-cold dampness itself. How many? The search was systematic but horrifying. Teams of officers ventured into the tunnels in groups of no fewer than 6, armed with electric torches, whistles to signal for help, and revolvers, though what good a gun would do against someone who knew these tunnels intimately was unclear. They found more bodies. By March 20th, 6 days after the initial discovery, the count had reached 12. All showed similar patterns: blunt force trauma to the back of the head, bodies left in various chambers and passages, some partially concealed, others left in the open where only darkness provided cover. The victims ranged in age from a teenager to an elderly man, both sexes, various social classes judging by their clothing. There was no apparent pattern beyond the method of killing and the location of disposal. The press inevitably discovered the story. Despite Inspector Devereaux's best efforts at containment, journalists caught wind of multiple police operations in the catacombs. By March 22nd, headlines screamed across Parisian newspapers. Massacre in the catacombs. Killer stalks beneath Paris. Empire of Death claims new victims. Public panic was immediate and severe. People avoided basements. Rumors spread of the killer emerging through hidden passages to murder people in their homes. The official catacomb tours were suspended. The prefecture received hundreds of reports of suspicious noises, strange figures near known catacomb entrances, basement walls that supposedly concealed passages. Most were hysteria. Some were not. Inspector Devereaux had assembled a team of specialists. Dr. Beaumont coordinated the medical examination of bodies. A police surveyor named Gerard worked to map the murder sites, looking for patterns in the geography of death. And a criminal anthropologist, Dr. Marguerite Caron, one of the few women in French police, analyzed the psychological profile of whoever was responsible. This is not a crime of passion, she explained to Devereaux. As they stood in the prefecture headquarters, surrounded by photographs of the catacomb chambers and sketches of body positions, the kills are efficient, methodical. Striking from behind suggests the victims were led into the tunnels, trusting their killer enough to turn their backs. The concealment varies. Some bodies are carefully hidden, others left exposed, which suggests either evolving method or varying circumstances. Perhaps some victims were missed by the killer who expected them to be found, while others were meant to remain hidden indefinitely. Motive? Devereaux asked. Dr. Caron shook her head. That's what troubles me. There's no sexual component. The bodies show no signs of assault beyond the killing blow. There's no consistent robbery. Some victims retained valuables, others were stripped. And there's no obvious selection pattern. Young and old, male and female, rich and poor. It's as if the killer simply murders whoever they encounter in the tunnels. Then why lead them down there at all? Perhaps they don't, she said softly. Perhaps these are cataphiles, explorers who ventured into the tunnels and encountered someone who has made the catacombs their territory. Someone who sees them as intruders. Someone who has been down there long enough to go mad. This theory gained support when investigators found more evidence of long-term habitation. Beyond the first chamber Augusta's group had discovered, they found others, small spaces carved into the limestone or natural alcoves, containing remnants of human occupation. Blankets, food containers, candle stubs, even crude attempts at furniture made from scavenged bones and planks of wood that must have been dragged down from the surface. Whoever lived in these spaces had been there for months, possibly years. They had created a network of sanctuaries throughout the tunnels, apparently moving between them to avoid detection. And they had killed anyone who came too close to discovering them. But who were they? And how had they survived? The answers began emerging from the missing persons files. A clerk named Bertrand compiled a list of everyone reported missing in Paris over the previous year, whose case remained unsolved. The list was long, over 300 names, but cross-referencing with the catacomb victims' descriptions began yielding matches. One of the first bodies discovered was identified as Claude Mercier, a medical student who had disappeared in December 1903. His parents identified him by a distinctive scar on his left hand and a silver ring he always wore. He had told friends he planned to explore the restricted catacombs, searching for a rumored chamber that supposedly contained treasures hidden during the Revolution. Another victim was Marie-Louise Petit, a seamstress who had vanished in January. Her sister identified her by her clothing and a locket she wore. Marie-Louise had been seeing a man, her sister recalled, someone she had met at a cafe near Montparnasse. He had been fascinated by the catacombs, had talked about the mysteries hidden below Paris. Marie-Louise had mentioned, shortly before she disappeared, that he was going to show her something wonderful underground, something few people had ever seen. He, Inspector Devereaux repeated, seizing on the pronoun. Your sister mentioned a man specifically? The sister nodded, wringing her hands. She said he was strange but kind, quiet. He wore shabby clothes like a worker but spoke well, educated. He had dark hair and a beard, she said, and eyes that were... She used the word haunted. She said his eyes looked haunted. A description at last. It wasn't much, but it was something. Other families came forward as bodies were identified. Each story was similar. The victim had been interested in the catacombs, or had met someone who was, or had simply mentioned visiting the underground tunnels shortly before disappearing. Some had been cataphiles, experienced explorers who should have known the dangers. Others had been naive tourists, seduced by the romance of Paris's hidden depths. All had encountered someone who lived in that darkness. Someone who had made the Empire of Death their kingdom. By late March, the police search had expanded to unprecedented scope. Every known entrance to the restricted catacombs was under surveillance. Officers patrolled the public sections constantly. Teams swept through the tunnels daily, marking cleared areas with painted symbols, methodically eliminating hiding places, and slowly, inexorably, they pushed the killer deeper into the labyrinth. The evidence suggested desperation. Food caches found in the inhabited chambers were depleted. Blankets and supplies were abandoned in apparent haste. The killer was running, retreating into sections of the catacombs so remote that even experienced cataphiles feared to venture there. Tunnels that flooded seasonally. Chambers with unstable ceilings, passages that descended to depths where the air itself became questionable. On March 28th, officers searching near the Place d'Italie found fresh footprints, those same strange, barefoot impressions, leading into a tunnel marked as dangerous on their maps. The passage was narrow, the ceiling low, and it descended steeply into water that reflected their torchlight like black glass. Inspector Devereaux assembled a team of 6 officers, all volunteers, all aware of the risks. They would pursue the footprints as far as they could safely go. The descent was treacherous. The passage twisted, doubled back on itself, required them to wade through water that rose from ankle deep to waist deep, and then receded again. The ceiling dripped constantly, and the sound of their breathing echoed strangely in the confined space, making it seem as if they were being followed by shadows that breathed in perfect synchronization. The footprints continued, sometimes visible in patches of mud, sometimes disappearing into water only to reappear on the far side. Whoever they were chasing moved through these tunnels with complete confidence, taking routes that would confuse or deter pursuers. After perhaps 2 hours of careful pursuit, they emerged into a chamber unlike any they had seen before. It was vast, perhaps 20 meters across, with a vaulted ceiling that rose into darkness beyond their torchlight's reach. The walls were covered in carvings, not the organized bone decorations of the official ossuary, but something older, stranger. Symbols that might have been religious or protective, or simply the mad scratching of someone who had spent too long in darkness. At the chamber's center, a natural pillar of limestone rose like a stalagmite, and around it were arranged bones and patterns that suggested ritual or obsession, circles of skulls, walls of femurs, arches constructed from ribs and vertebrae, and sitting on a throne made of bones, barely visible in the uncertain light, was a figure. He was as the seamstress's sister had described, dark-haired, bearded, wearing clothes so filthy and worn they seemed part of the darkness itself, but his eyes were what held them frozen. They reflected the torchlight like an animal's eyes, bright and wild and utterly inhuman. "Stop!" Inspector Devereaux commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You are under arrest for murder. Come with us peacefully." The figure didn't move, didn't speak, simply stared at them with those terrible eyes. One of the officers raised his revolver, hands shaking. "Inspector, he's—" The figure moved. It was impossibly fast, a movement that seemed to defy the frailty of human muscle. One moment sitting, the next vanishing into a passage behind the bone throne that none of them had noticed until that instant. The pursuit that followed was chaos. The officers split, trying to cover multiple passages, their torches swinging wildly, creating a strobe effect that made navigation nightmarish. They shouted to each other, their voices overlapping and echoing until they could no longer determine which shouts were current and which were merely echoes. Officer Petit, youngest of the group, found himself separated from his companions, following footsteps that seemed always just ahead. His torch beam caught glimpses, a figure turning a corner, a hand pressed against stone, the swirl of dark fabric disappearing into shadow. He emerged into a smaller chamber and found himself face to face with the killer. Up close, the man was terrible to see. His skin was pale, colorless from years without sunlight, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, as if he were slowly becoming one of the skeletons that surrounded them. His beard was matted, his hair long and tangled. But his eyes were intelligent, aware, filled with a cunning that had kept him alive in these tunnels for God knows how long, and in his hand he held a length of iron pipe, rust-stained and heavy. "Please," Pettit whispered, raising his hands, his revolver still holstered. "We don't want to hurt you. Just come with us. Whatever you've done, whatever drove you to this—" The man spoke. His voice was a rasp, barely human after disuse. But the words were clear enough. "They invaded my home." Then he lunged. Petit barely got his arms up before the pipe connected. A glancing blow that sent him staggering backward, his torch clattering away across stone. He fumbled for his revolver, got it halfway out of the holster before another blow struck his shoulder, sending lightning bolts of pain down his arm. He fell, and the killer stood over him, raising the pipe for a final blow that would crush his skull just like all the others. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The killer spun, clutching his side where blood spread across his filthy shirt. Behind him stood Inspector Devereaux, his revolver smoking, his face grim. "Drop the weapon," Devereaux commanded. The killer looked at him, then at the spreading blood on his shirt. Then, incredibly, he smiled. A rictus grin that showed teeth gone black from years without care. "You cannot take me from here," he said, his voice growing stronger now, almost triumphant. "I am part of the catacombs. I am the bones. I am the darkness. I have been down here so long that I'm more dead than alive. And you cannot kill what's already dead." He turned and ran, clutching his wounded side, leaving a trail of blood drops on the stone, but he was injured now and slow. The officers pursued, following the blood trail through passages that grew narrower, more treacherous. The killer's sanctuary was collapsing around him, his knowledge of the tunnels no longer enough to save him when his own blood betrayed his route. They found him collapsed in a passage barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, his breathing shallow, blood pooling beneath him. Inspector Devereaux knelt beside him, checking for weapons, finding none. "What is your name?" the inspector asked. The killer's eyes focused with difficulty. Jean Moreau. "At least that was my name, in another life. When I lived above." "Why did you come down here?" A rasping laugh that turned into a cough. "Why does anyone flee?" "I was running from debts, from shame, from a wife who despised me and children who barely knew me. I thought I would hide for a few days, maybe a week. Then I would emerge, start fresh somewhere else. But you never left." "I found peace here," Moreau whispered. "In the darkness, among the bones. No one judging, no one demanding, just silence and death, which is honest at least. The dead don't lie. They don't betray. They just are." "And the people you killed?" His expression changed, becoming confused, almost childlike. "They invaded. I built a home down here, made it mine. And they came, with their lights and their voices and their questions. They were going to expose me, drive me back to the surface, back to that terrible life. I couldn't allow that. I had to protect my sanctuary. 12 people, Devereaux said, his voice hard. 12 people dead because you wanted to hide from your responsibilities." Moreau's laugh was bitter. 12, is that all you found? I've been down here for 3 years, Inspector. 3 years protecting my home. 12 is merely what you've discovered so far. The implication hung in the air, terrible in its simplicity. Moreau died before they could get him to the surface. The bullet had struck something vital, and the exertion of fleeing had hastened internal bleeding. He expired in that narrow passage, his last words a murmur about darkness being kinder than light. The search that followed Moreau's death was exhaustive and horrifying. Over the next 3 weeks, police teams combed through the catacombs with methodical precision, marking every passage, searching every chamber, looking for more bodies. They found them. By the end of April, the official count had reached 27. 27 victims spanning 3 years, killed methodically by a man who had transformed himself from a bankrupt clerk into something that barely resembled humanity, a creature of darkness who murdered to protect his subterranean kingdom. The victims represented a cross-section of Parisian society. There were students who had sought adventure, workers who had heard rumors of hidden treasures, lovers who had come seeking privacy in the forbidden tunnels. Some were experienced cataphiles who should have known better. Others were naive tourists lured by the romance of exploring beneath the city of light. Jean Moreau's background emerged through police investigation. He had been, as he claimed, a clerk, specifically an accountant for a textile merchant in the Marais district. By all accounts, he had been unremarkable. He had married at 23, fathered 3 children, lived in a modest apartment, attended church irregularly, and showed no signs of violence or instability. Then, in late 1900, his employer had discovered discrepancies in the accounts. Moreau had been embezzling, small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums, attempting to cover gambling debts and maintain a lifestyle slightly above his means. When confronted, he had fled rather than face prosecution. His wife, when located by police, showed no surprise at the news of his crimes or his death. He was always weak, she said flatly, refusing to view his body or claim it for burial. He couldn't face consequences, so he ran, like he always ran from everything difficult. I'm not surprised he chose to hide in a tomb. He was already dead inside. The children, now young adults, had no memory of him. He had vanished when they were small, and their mother had told them he had died. In a sense, she had been telling the truth. But how had Moreau survived for 3 years beneath Paris? The investigation revealed a disturbing ingenuity. He had established multiple campsites throughout the tunnels, stocked with supplies stolen from the surface. At night, he had emerged through hidden passages into basements, stealing food, blankets, tools, candles, anything he needed. He had become an expert at moving unseen through a city of 2 million people, a ghost who existed in the spaces between the living world and the realm of the dead. He had also, apparently, studied the catacomb tunnels with obsessive dedication. Maps found in his main campsite showed a level of detail that surpassed even official surveys. He had explored passages no one else dared enter, discovered chambers that had been sealed off and forgotten, learned the hydrology and geology of his underground kingdom with the thoroughness of a scholar, and he had killed to protect it. The psychological profile Dr. Karen compiled painted a picture of progressive isolation and madness. Moreau had likely suffered from what would later be called dissociative identity disorder, separating his surface world self from his underground existence so completely that he could commit murder without apparent remorse. He had transformed himself into something other than human, a guardian of the dead, a creature who belonged more to the empire of death than to the world of the living. He wasn't insane by legal standards, Dr. Karen explained to a room of senior police officials. He knew what he was doing. He chose his victims, planned his attacks, concealed evidence. But psychologically, he had undergone a transformation that allowed him to rationalize his actions. In his mind, he wasn't murdering people. He was defending his territory, much as an animal might. He had regressed to something primitive, primal. Could there be others like him? Someone asked. Other people living in the catacombs, hiding from the law or from life? The question hung heavy in the room. The truth was, they didn't know. The catacombs were vast, largely unmapped, containing countless chambers and passages where someone could hide indefinitely. The police had only searched the sections accessible from known entrances. There could be others, deeper in the labyrinth, living in darkness, sustained by theft and murder. The prefecture's solution was draconian. Every known entrance to the restricted catacombs was sealed with iron gates and concrete. Basements in certain districts were inspected for hidden passages, which were bricked up when found. Penalties for unauthorized catacomb exploration were increased dramatically, from fines to imprisonment. But even those implementing these measures knew the truth. You cannot truly seal 200 miles of tunnels. Somewhere hidden passages remained. Somewhere darkness persisted. And in that darkness, who knew what might be living? There was no trial, of course. Moreau had died in the tunnels he had made his kingdom, bleeding out in darkness like so many of his victims. But the prefecture organized a formal inquest, both to satisfy public demand for accountability and to establish an official record of the case. The proceedings took place in May 1904, in a courtroom packed with journalists, curious citizens, and families of the identified victims. Inspector Devereaux testified for 3 days, methodically describing the investigation, the discoveries, the final confrontation. Dr. Beaumont presented medical evidence. Dr. Karen explained her psychological analysis, and the family spoke, brief, heartbreaking testimonies about the people who had been lost. Claude Mercier's mother, aged beyond her years by grief, described her son's fascination with history and exploration. He wanted to be an archaeologist, she said, her voice barely audible. He was so excited about the catacombs, about the idea of discovering something no one else had seen. I told him to be careful. I told him the tunnels were dangerous. But I never imagined, her voice broke. She couldn't continue. Marie-Louise Petit's sister testified about the man her sibling had met, the one with the haunted eyes. I should have warned her, she whispered. I should have told her not to go with him. But she was lonely, and he seemed kind, and Paris has so many strange people that one more didn't seem dangerous. How could I have known? 17 families gave testimony. 10 victims remained unidentified, their bodies too decomposed, their possessions too generic, their absence unreported by anyone who cared enough to file a missing person report. These were Paris's invisible people, the poor, the transient, the forgotten, whose deaths went unmourned except in the abstract. The formal verdict was straightforward. Jean Moreau, while evading prosecution for embezzlement, had committed at least 27 murders between 1901 and 1904 in the restricted sections of the Paris Catacombs. He had been killed while resisting arrest. The case was closed, but the questions remained. Why had no one noticed the pattern earlier? 27 people had disappeared, many in circumstances that should have raised alarms. But Paris was large, and missing persons cases were common, and without bodies or evidence, most investigations had stalled and been filed away. Moreau had chosen his hunting ground brilliantly, a place where bodies could remain hidden for years, where evidence was swallowed by darkness, where the very vastness of the space defeated systematic searches. The inquest also raised uncomfortable questions about the catacombs themselves. Should they exist at all? The original purpose, relieving overcrowded cemeteries, had been served. But now they represented a liability, a vast underground space that couldn't be properly secured or monitored. Some officials argued for filling in the tunnels entirely, pumping concrete into the void until the empire of death was sealed forever. Engineers dismissed this as impractical. The tunnels were too extensive, too interconnected with the city's foundation. Filling them might destabilize buildings above, cause unpredictable subsidence, create new problems while solving old ones. Paris was built on these hollowed-out foundations. They were part of the city's structure now, like veins and arteries in a living body. You couldn't remove them without killing the patient, so the compromise was containment. The entrances were sealed, patrols were established, and Parisians were told to report any suspicious activity near known catacomb access points. The catacombs would remain, but they would be forbidden. A secret space beneath the city that existed but could not be accessed. Officially. Of the 27 confirmed victims, 10 were never identified. Their bodies had been too decomposed, their clothing too generic, their physical characteristics too ordinary to distinguish them from the thousands of people who passed through Paris unnoticed and unmourned. They were given numbers instead of names. Victim number 4, victim number 11, victim number 23, and buried in a mass grave in the Cimetière de Thiers, south of Paris, a simple stone marker was erected. Here lie the unknown victims of the catacombs, 901, 1904, murdered by darkness, remembered by light. But even this modest memorial raised questions that haunted Inspector Devereaux for the rest of his career. Who were they, these 10 unnamed dead? What had brought them to the catacombs? What final thoughts had crossed their minds as Moreau's iron pipe descended toward their skulls? Did they have families somewhere, still waiting, still wondering what had happened to their missing son or daughter or spouse? Or were they truly alone in the world, so disconnected from society that their absence created no void, raised no alarm, left no trace? Devereaux had copies made of the morgue photographs, grim, clinical images of faces destroyed by death and decay. He sent them to police departments throughout France, to newspapers, to organizations that tracked missing persons. A few inquiries came back, tentative identifications that couldn't be confirmed, grieving parents who saw their lost children in every unidentified victim. But nothing definitive, nothing certain. The 10 remained unknown. Dr. Karen suggested that this anonymity was perhaps fitting. They were invisible in life, she said during one of their final conversations about the case. Poor, transient, marginal. Paris has thousands like them, people who exist in the gaps of society, who survive without documentation or official recognition. Moreau preyed on the vulnerable, on those whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed. In death, they remain what they were in life, unseen. That doesn't make it right, Devereaux replied. No, she agreed. But it makes it Paris. Any great city has its shadows, its hidden population, its people who fall through the cracks. Moreau simply took advantage of what was already there, a system that allowed people to vanish without consequence. The conversation haunted Devereaux. He had always believed in order, in systems, in the idea that society protected its members. The Catacombs case had revealed the lie beneath this belief. Society protected those it valued. Everyone else survived on luck and the grace of strangers, and in the catacombs there had been no grace, only darkness and death. But even after the official case closed, mysteries remained. The most troubling concerned Moreau's timeline. He claimed to have been in the catacombs for 3 years, beginning in late 1900 or early 1901. The earliest victim, whose death could be reliably dated, had disappeared in March 1901, just months after Moreau's flight from justice. But there were anomalies. Several items found in Moreau's campsites predated his known entry into the catacombs. A blanket that, according to its manufacturer, hadn't been produced until 1899, a lantern design that was only sold between 1897 and 1899. Food, tins with expiration dates suggesting they had been stored underground since at least 1898. Perhaps he was lying about the timeline, one investigator suggested. Perhaps he fled to the catacombs earlier than we thought, or returned to them multiple times before his final disappearance. But Moreau's wife insisted her husband had lived at home until December 1900. His employer confirmed he had worked until that date. There were witnesses to his presence in the surface world. So whose supplies were those? Who else had lived in the catacombs before Moreau? And more disturbing, when police carefully inventoried the items found in Moreau's campsites, they discovered clothing that didn't match any known victim. Women's shoes in sizes that corresponded to none of the identified bodies. Men's coats that were too large or too small for any of the deceased. Personal items, a hairbrush, a razor, a prayer book, that suggested other people, other stories, other victims. There may have been more, Dr. Beaumont admitted in his final report. The catacombs are vast, and we only searched sections accessible from known entrances. Moreau spoke of protecting his sanctuary for 3 years, but what if there were others before him? What if he wasn't the first to discover that the catacombs made a perfect hunting ground? The prefecture quietly investigated this possibility. They reviewed missing persons cases going back a decade, looking for patterns. People who had disappeared near catacomb entrances, victims whose cases had commonalities. What they found was inconclusive but deeply unsettling. Between 1890 and 1900, at least 40 people had vanished in circumstances that could suggest catacomb involvement. Not all, certainly. Some had likely left Paris voluntarily or met other fates. But the numbers were striking. 40 people vanished without trace, many last seen in districts above the most extensive tunnel networks. Had there been other killers? There are more down there, he told a young officer who accompanied him on one such visit in 1909, 5 years after the case closed. More bodies we never found, more secrets that darkness keeps. The catacombs are patient. They don't give up their dead easily. Should we search again? The young officer asked. Devereaux shook his head slowly. No, some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some darkness should stay dark. We found Moreau, stopped his killing, gave closure to some families. That's more than most cases achieve. The rest? He gestured toward the gates, toward the invisible tunnels beyond them. The rest belongs to the bones now. Let them keep their secrets. The Moreau case changed Paris in subtle but significant ways. The catacombs, once a minor curiosity, became infamous. The sealed entrances attracted morbid tourists who wanted photographs beside the gates that barred access to murder. Entrepreneurs sold maps claiming to show Moreau's killing chambers. Most were fabrications. But they sold well to sensation seekers. The legitimate cataphile community, explorers who had navigated the tunnels responsibly for years, found themselves targeted by new regulations. What had once been tolerated as harmless eccentricity was now treated as dangerous criminal behavior. Several experienced explorers were arrested and prosecuted, their maps confiscated, their knowledge of the underground dismissed as potential threats to public safety. Some of these cataphiles insisted that Moreau had not been alone. They spoke of encountering strange signs in the tunnels, evidence of recent human presence in areas that should have been abandoned. Fresh scratches on walls, footprints that couldn't be explained. sounds that suggested someone was moving through passages just beyond the reach of their lights. The prefecture dismissed these reports as hysteria or attention-seeking, but the reports persisted. In 1907, a group of urban explorers who had entered the catacombs through an unsealed basement passage reported finding a chamber that matched descriptions of one of Moreau's campsites, but the supplies there were fresh. New blankets, recent food tins, candles that had been burned within days, not years. When police investigated, they found the chamber empty. The basement passage had been resealed. The explorers couldn't reproduce their route, couldn't prove what they had seen. The incident was dismissed as a hoax, but the pattern continued. Every few years, someone would report evidence of human habitation in the sealed catacombs. Fresh graffiti appearing on walls that should have been inaccessible. Sounds of footsteps reported by residents whose basements adjoined the tunnels. Items disappearing from homes near known catacomb entrances. Food, blankets, tools, taken by someone who came and went like a ghost. Were there others living in the darkness? Homeless people who had found refuge in the one place police no longer patrolled? Criminals hiding from justice as Moreau had hidden? Or simply cataphiles who refused to be barred from the tunnels they had explored for decades, who knew secret entrances and moved through the darkness with practiced confidence? No one knew for certain. The catacombs kept their secrets. In 1955, a cave-in near the Rue de la Tombe Issoire revealed a previously unknown chamber. Workers sent to stabilize the collapse found human remains. Not ancient bones like those stacked in the ossuary, but relatively recent bodies, perhaps 50 years old. The skeletons showed signs of trauma consistent with Moreau's victims. Blunt force damage to the skulls. 5 bodies, never identified, never explained. Were they additional Moreau victims, overlooked in the original search? Or had there been another killer? Another creature of darkness who had made the catacombs their kingdom? The investigation was brief and inconclusive. The bodies were buried, the chamber sealed, the incident filed away. Paris had more pressing concerns than ancient murders in forgotten tunnels. But those who remembered the original case couldn't help wondering. Dr. Caron, elderly now but still sharp, published a paper suggesting that Moreau might not have been an isolated phenomenon. "The catacombs represent a psychological space," she wrote, "where social norms dissolve, where human beings can regress to primitive states. Moreau transformed himself from a civilized man into a predator. But what makes us think he was unique? The conditions that created him still exist. The darkness still exists. And in that darkness, evolution runs backward, stripping away civilization's thin veneer." Her paper was largely ignored by academic circles, but it was read carefully by the few officers at the prefecture who remembered the Moreau case, who had walked through those tunnels and felt the oppressive weight of 6 million dead pressing down from the walls. They knew the truth. Even if they couldn't prove it, the catacombs were not empty. They would never be empty. Something about that darkness called to certain people, offering sanctuary or madness or both. And in those depths, beyond the reach of law or light, humanity could become something else entirely. Today, more than a century after Jean Moreau's killing spree, the Paris Catacombs remain controversial. The official tours reopened in 1955, carefully controlled, following a predetermined route through sanitized passages where bones are arranged artistically and no trace of the murders remains. Tourists descend the spiral staircase, walk through the Empire of Death, take photographs beside walls of skulls, and emerge convinced they've experienced something profound. Most never realize they've seen less than 1% of the actual tunnel network. The rest remains forbidden. The gates are still locked. Warning signs still declare the catacombs off limits. Penalties for unauthorized exploration are severe, up to $60 in fines and possible imprisonment. But the cataphiles persist, using maps passed down through generations, finding entrances the police don't know exist or can't effectively seal. They continue exploring the forbidden tunnels. They document their journeys online, posting photographs of chambers that officially don't exist, describing routes that officially aren't there, and sometimes they report strange discoveries. In 2004, exactly 1 century after Moreau's death, a group of explorers found a chamber deep in the restricted section. Inside was a fully functional movie theater, complete with screen, projector, seating carved from limestone, even a bar stocked with beverages. The film in the projector was a 1950s noir thriller. The setup was sophisticated, suggesting regular use by people who knew the catacombs intimately. When police investigated 3 days later, the chamber was empty. Everything had been removed: screen, projector, furniture, all of it. Only the carved seating remained, proof that something had been there. Who had built it? Who had used it? How had they transported all that equipment into the tunnels and then removed it so completely? No answers emerged. The Catafiel community remained silent, protecting their own. The police eventually gave up. The chamber was resealed and officially forgotten. Stories like this persist. Urban legends mix with documented incidents, making it impossible to separate truth from fiction. Some claim there's an entire underground society living in the catacombs, complete with communities, rules, territories. Others insist the tunnels are haunted, that the spirits of Moreau's victims still wander the darkness, searching for the surface they never reached. The reality is probably more mundane, but no less fascinating. The catacombs represent freedom from the surveilled modern world, a space where people can exist without documentation or observation. For the homeless, they offer shelter. For explorers, they offer adventure. For artists, they offer an underground gallery where work can be created without permission or profit motive. For those fleeing law or life, they offer the same thing they offered Moreau: a place to disappear. But Moreau's ghost haunts the tunnels still. Every Catafiel knows his story, knows that the darkness once sheltered a murderer, knows that someone walking these passages transformed into something monstrous. And they wonder, could it happen again? The psychological conditions Dr. Karen identified, isolation, darkness, the dissolution of social norms, remain. The tunnels remain. The opportunity for someone to hide, to hunt, to kill in a space where bodies might never be found. That opportunity remains. In 2017, police investigating a missing person case followed leads into the catacombs. They found no sign of the missing man, but they did find evidence of recent habitation: blankets, food wrappers, a makeshift toilet. Someone was living down there, existing in darkness, sustained by theft or charity or who knows what means. The police sealed the access point they had used and continued their search on the surface. The missing man was eventually found. He had simply left Paris, starting a new life elsewhere. The case closed, but that evidence of habitation was never explained. Who was living in the catacombs in 2017? Are they still there now? Have they encountered other explorers? Have they learned, as Moreau learned, that murder is easier in darkness? We don't know. We can't know. The catacombs are too vast, too labyrinthine, too fundamentally unknowable for certainty, and perhaps that's fitting. In an age of GPS and surveillance cameras and digital documentation of every moment, the catacombs remain a space of mystery. They represent the limits of human. But beneath Paris, the tunnels continue. The darkness continues. And in that darkness, 6 million skeletons keep their eternal silence, guarding whatever secrets the shadows choose to preserve. The story of the Paris Catacombs murders remains one of the most disturbing cases in French criminal history, not just for the brutality of the crimes, but for what they revealed about the city itself. Paris, the city of light, built its beauty on foundations of death. 6 million bodies, stripped of identity and humanity, arranged in walls and patterns by people who never knew their names. The catacombs were created as a practical solution to a sanitation problem, but they became something else, a monument to mortality. A reminder that beneath all civilization lies the same darkness, the same inevitable decay. Moreau understood this in his twisted way. He fled to the one place where death was normalized, where human remains were simply material to be stacked and arranged. In the catacombs, murder didn't seem aberrant. It was just adding more bones to a place already filled with them. But what the case ultimately revealed was more disturbing than one man's crimes. It exposed the fragility of the social contract, the thin membrane separating order from chaos. Moreau was not insane by medical standards. He was simply someone who had stopped believing in the rules, who had found a space where rules didn't apply, who had embraced the darkness that exists, literally and figuratively, beneath all human civilization. And he was not unique. History is filled with people who transformed from ordinary citizens into monsters, given the right circumstances and the right opportunity. The catacombs simply provided a particularly effective combination: isolation that breeds madness, darkness that conceals crime, and a victim pool of vulnerable people whose disappearances would go unnoticed. The 10 unidentified victims haunt this story most of all. They represent everyone who falls through society's cracks, everyone whose absence creates no void, everyone who dies without witness or memory. In life they were invisible, in death they remain unknown. Moreau killed them in darkness, and darkness keeps them still. Inspector Devereaux, in his memoirs published shortly before his death in 1932, wrote about the case with lingering unease. I have investigated many murders in my career. Some were passionate crimes, others calculated. But the Catacombs case was different. It wasn't just about murder. It was about the darkness we all carry inside, the darkness that civilization barely contains. Moreau didn't become a monster in the catacombs. He simply found a place where the monster inside could emerge without consequence. And that terrifies me more than any crime I've encountered. Because if the right circumstances exist, any of us could make that same transformation. Any of us could become creatures of darkness. He's right to be terrified. The Catacombs murders demonstrate something we prefer not to acknowledge. Civilization is fragile. Morality is conditional, and the veneer of humanity is thinner than we like to believe. To this day, the Paris Catacombs remain Paris's dark heart, pumping not blood but history through the veins of the city. The tunnels continue, vast and largely unknown. The bones remain, arranged in their eternal patterns. And the darkness persists, patient and unchanging. On quiet nights, when tourists have finished their sanitized tours and the official entrances have been locked and the city above sleeps its restless sleep, people claim